When individuals encounter the term Crusades, they typically envision religious extremism, warriors advancing beneath crosses, sacred conflicts waged for conviction, prestige, and redemption. And certainly, conviction mattered significantly. However, conviction alone doesn't mobilize forces across continents. Conviction doesn't nourish tens of thousands of individuals. Conviction doesn't construct vessels, furnish horses, or compensate for steel. Currency does. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where currency, authority, and history intersect. And nothing exists as straightforward as it appears in the year 1095. Europe was not a prosperous location. It was divided, brutal, and economically ineffective. Authority was decentralized. Monarchs governed weakly. Aristocrats controlled territory, but lacked financial flexibility. There were zero permanent national forces, zero centralized taxation frameworks, and zero professional administrations capable of funding long-distance conflict. Prosperity existed primarily as territory, not cash. You could direct peasants, you could obtain provisions, but you couldn't easily generate currency. And yet within several years, tens of thousands of individuals would journey thousands of miles across hostile terrain to combat in the eastern Mediterranean. They would require weaponry, protection, horses, vessels, provisions, and months, sometimes years, of supply assistance. By any contemporary measure, it was a military endeavor that should have been unachievable. The summons that initiated this action arrived in November of 1095 when Pope Urban II addressed an audience at the Council of Clermont. His communication was spiritual: reclaim Jerusalem, protect Christendom, obtain redemption. But beneath the theology was something different. A massive redirection of Europe's surplus aggression outward, and accidentally at first, the establishment of a new monetary ecosystem. Urban II wasn't marketing a conflict to monarchs. He was marketing legitimacy to individuals. The audience at Clermont was filled with knights, landholding combatants whose social character revolved around aggression, yet whose aggression was increasingly denounced by the church. These were not rulers with treasuries, but second and third offspring with zero inheritance, vassals bound by military duty, household warriors whose survival depended on combat. For them, Crusade wasn't merely a religious summons, it was a social examination. To depart was to demonstrate prestige, allegiance, and devotion. To remain behind was to risk suspicion, moral disgrace, even isolation. Once prominent aristocrats accepted the cross, pressure cascaded downward. Involvement became contagious. Conviction opened the entrance, but prestige culture pushed individuals through it. And they didn't depart alone. Crusading forces were not professional armies, they were relocating societies. Knights brought attendants, servants, artisans, clergy, workers, and dependents. Thousands of non-fighters whose presence transformed expeditions into mass relocations. Europe didn't merely export warriors. It exported surplus aggression, instability, and social friction outward, redirecting it toward a distant boundary where redemption was the only guaranteed reward. The initial crusade, launched between 1096 and 1099, involved an estimated 60 to 100,000 individuals, including non-fighters. For individual knights, the expense of involvement could equal multiple years of earnings. There were zero state allowances, zero war securities, zero treasury payments. Crusaders had to fund themselves, so they liquidated. Aristocrats sold territory at steep reductions. They mortgaged properties to monasteries. They borrowed extensively from capital lenders. Some pledged future harvests. Others committed political advantages. What mattered was not long-term sustainability, but immediate financial flexibility. Redemption was time-critical. Obligation could be addressed later. This was the initial quiet transformation. Conflict ceased being something you merely fought, became something you funded. And once conflict becomes a monetary operation, it starts attracting intermediaries. Italian merchant republics like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa quickly comprehended what was occurring. Crusaders didn't merely require swords. They required vessels, conveyance, credit, provisions, ports, storage, protection against loss. These cities were not crusading purely from devotion. They were marketing services to a continent desperate to relocate forces and materials eastward. By the early 12th century, crusading paths had become commerce paths. Ports that serviced crusaders grew prosperous. Vessel builders expanded. Agreements multiplied. What began as religious mobilization evolved into a supply industry, and the church observed all of this attentively. The medieval church was not merely a spiritual institution. It was a transnational organization functioning across unstable kingdoms. It possessed territory. It managed courts. It educated elites. It documented births and deaths. And crucially, it had moral power that zero monarch could equal. But it did not possess a permanent taxation framework. It could not merely levy earnings taxes or issue obligation in the contemporary understanding. The Crusades transformed that to fund ongoing campaigns, the church authorized new taxation forms. Clergy were taxed. Laity were taxed. In some instances, individuals could compensate instead of fighting. Indulgences were provided in return for monetary assistance. What began as emergency fundraising slowly solidified into recurring income. This is where conviction became influence. The more the Crusades persisted, the more permanent their monetary structures became. Military organizations like the Knights Templar, established around 1119, emerged to safeguard pilgrims in combat in the Holy Territory. But they quickly evolved into something different. They accepted deposits. They conveyed funds across boundaries. They issued early versions of letters of credit, permitting pilgrims to journey without transporting large quantities of cash. By the 12th century, the Templars were managing one of the most sophisticated monetary networks in Europe, wearing protection, but thinking like financiers. And then arrived the moment that removed any illusion that conviction was always the primary motivator. In 1202, the Fourth Crusade was launched. Crusaders contracted Venice to convey them to the east. The compensation was enormous. When the Crusaders couldn't compensate, Venice didn't cancel the expedition. It redirected it first to attack the Christian city of Zara, then in 1204 to plunder Constantinople itself, one of the most prosperous Christian cities in the world, using crusaders as mercenaries. The consequence was catastrophic for Byzantium. The consequence was enormously profitable for Venice. Commerce, privileges, territory, prosperity, influence. The crusade had not failed. It had merely followed the currency by this point. The pattern was established. The Crusades had generated a framework where conviction mobilized individuals, but financing determined outcomes. Institutions learned how to obtain worth from moral language. Conflict became sustainable not because it succeeded militarily, but because it generated economic activity. Europe did not stumble into this transformation consciously. It learned by executing. And once the machinery existed, merchants, financiers, taxes, military organizations, it no longer depended on spiritual enthusiasm alone. The Crusades would eventually lose their religious urgency. Jerusalem would change control. Acre would collapse in 1291, terminating the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Territory. But the monetary structures constructed to sustain holy conflict did not vanish. They evolved. Because once a society learns how to fund authority, it rarely forgets. By the period the Crusades entered their second century, the machinery surrounding them mattered more than the battlefield outcomes themselves. What had begun as a desperate mobilization of conviction had solidified into a repeatable procedure, one that reliably converted conviction into currency and currency into institutional authority. And like all frameworks that learned how to obtain worth, it began to influence motivations in manners few participants fully comprehended. At the period, the initial clear winners were the intermediaries. Italian merchant republics didn't require the Crusades to succeed militarily. They required them to persist. As long as forces relocated east, vessels were required. Provisions were needed. Credit had to circulate. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa embedded themselves so deeply into crusading supply that conflict became a commercial dependency. Ports expanded, shipyards multiplied, agreements replaced commitments. The crusader might combat for redemption, but the merchant sailed for profit. This transformation mattered because it modified who bore the danger. When a crusade failed, the losses were not evenly distributed. The aristocrats who sold territory to fund involvement often returned destroyed, if they returned whatsoever. Peasants absorbed elevated taxes to assist absent lords. Local economies were destabilized by sudden liquidation of properties. Meanwhile, the institutions that funded conveyance and supply collected fees regardless of outcome. Conflict had become asymmetric. Losses were personal. Revenues were institutional. Military organizations accelerated this imbalance. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers accumulated territory across Europe, received contributions from crusaders seeking spiritual protection, and managed holdings on a magnitude previously unknown. They were exempt from many local taxes. They answered directly to the Pope, and they functioned across boundaries with ease. In effect, they operated as multinational corporations centuries before the terminology existed, obtaining worth from conflict while remaining insulated from its immediate expenses. The church itself adapted rapidly. What began as emergency taxation to fund sacred conflict became normalized fiscal power. Crusading taxes, once temporary, were renewed repeatedly. Indulgences expanded beyond involvement to funding. The moral reasoning remained intact, but the monetary implications were profound. The church had discovered a method to raise income across boundaries without standing forces or administrations. Conviction accomplished the enforcement. Guilt handled compliance over period. The original justification began to matter less than the income stream it sustained. Crusades were launched against new targets, heretics, political adversaries, even Christian cities. The definition of sacred conflict expanded because the framework required new justifications to sustain itself. Once conflict became financially viable, peace became a threat to the institutions that depended on it, and then there were the losers, far more numerous and far less visible. Peasants compensated elevated rents and taxes to cover crusading obligations. Jewish communities were targeted as lenders and scapegoats, confronting persecution and massacre when obligations became politically inconvenient. Noble households collapsed under responsibilities they could not service. Territory consolidated into the control of institutions capable of surviving leverage. Prosperity flowed upward, not because of conquest alone, but because of funding. This is the component of the narrative often omitted. The Crusades did not merely drain Europe, they reorganized it. Capital became more concentrated. Authority shifted from landed combatants to institutions that comprehended credit, agreements, and magnitude. The medieval economy didn't modernize by accident. It was forged under pressure, shaped by obligation, and disciplined by conflict. By the late 13th century, the religious narrative was deteriorating. Military victories were rare. Public enthusiasm diminished. Jerusalem was lost, regained briefly, then lost permanently. Acre collapsed in 1291. The original spiritual commitment no longer matched reality. But the monetary structures constructed to sustain crusading did not vanish. They were repurposed. Taxation remained. Conflict financing evolved. Merchant republics pivoted from crusade to empire. Military organizations left legacies that informed future banking frameworks. Even as some like the Templars were eventually dismantled when their authority threatened monarchs, the instruction had been learned too thoroughly. Europe had discovered how to fund authority without resolving the moral contradictions that accompanied it. And that discovery didn't remain confined to the Middle Ages. Contemporary conflicts are framed differently, but the structure is familiar. Moral language still mobilizes public assistance. Monetary frameworks still absorb danger upward and distribute expenses downward. Contractors replace crusaders. Obligation replaces commitments. And once again, the machinery survives even when the original mission fades. History doesn't replicate, but it does train. The Crusades taught Europe that conviction can open wallets, that institutions can profit from permanence, and that once aggression is financialized, it becomes self-sustaining. That's the danger. Not conviction, not ideology, but frameworks that require conflict to justify their existence. Comprehending this doesn't make you cynical. It makes you prepared. Because when currency and authority align behind moral certainty, the expenses are rarely compensated by the individuals making the choices. If this provided you a new viewpoint, hit subscribe. History possesses the answers. I'll demonstrate you where to look.